Hello, I'm Ken Ortiz, and what you're tuning into is a occasional podcast that I've done. I actually began during the months before the election. I called it Election Reflections, and if you want to look back on some of those, you certainly can, but unfortunately it's all past history. But I thought I'd revise it after the election, and I changed the title to Abiding Under Biden. And what I meant by that basically is Christians, we have to recognize the reality of the world around us and how do we respond in a Christ-like manner and as good citizens as well in light of a new administration which is in many ways, so many ways, diametrically opposed to what the Bible describes as godly morality and godly ethics. So what I try to do in this podcast is provide a comprehensive and godly insights into our present moment in history. How should we live? How should we behave as Christians and as citizens? And in a way, I hope that you'll take this more than anything else as a way of being focused and fervent in your prayers, because many Christians just simply don't pay attention to what's going on or feel as if they're called to be apolitical. There is a view in many people's mind that if you're a serious Christian, then you don't worry about spiritual or political issues, but I don't believe that. Maybe I'll go into deeper explanation in some future podcast. But in a sense, when we pray, the way I simply put it is we ask for the best and we accept the rest. And so I think that we are in a moment where really the rights and privileges that we have been granted by this nation throughout its history to exercise our religious faith and maintain our own rights of conscience are being purposely threatened by a number of acts and legislations that are being passed down. 1 Chronicles 12:32 is one of my favorite passages when you talk about obscure favorite passages. It's speaking about the various tribes of Israel that came to anoint David as their king over the entire nation. And in it says that regarding the men of Issachar, the tribe of Issachar, they were men, he said, who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And so I really feel that that's my objective, to help us understand the moment that we're in, the times we're in, and to know how we should behave, how should we act in this moment, that we might have what Solomon referred to in Proverbs 14:8 as a sensible wisdom. That is, he says, the wisdom of the sensible is to understand his way, but the foolishness of fools is deceit. In other words, the foolishness of a fool is to be deceived, led astray, and either believe in a lie or not care whether something is true or not. And so we don't want to be in that case. In fact, it was somebody who recently made the statement I thought was really kind of clever. They said, common sense is so rare today, it's like having a superpower. So this is an opportunity for you to have a superpower, and it's a superpower of common sense. So hopefully you'll think that my perspective, or you'll agree with me that my perspectives on some of these things make good sense. But what I want to talk about today is really the beginning of a series of comments, what I call the Biden Blitzkrieg. And a Blitzkrieg is a term that I choose very advisedly because it parallels what happened in Nazi Germany, as are many of the events that we're dealing with right now. The idea that it never could happen again or it could never happen here is, of course, the confidence of fools. The fact is that history has an amazing way of replicating itself, not because it's fated to do so, but simply because human nature tends to always behave in the same patterns. We're slaves to our own nature, if you will, and the only thing that interrupts that is if you are born again of the Spirit of Jesus Christ and He comes and lives and reigns in your heart. But I want to begin by talking about something that's pretty obvious to almost all political observers, and that's the idea that the Biden presidency is then one of the most unusual, if not the most unusual, in the history of our nation. I mean, it's certainly marked, first of all, by the fact that we have, without question, and anybody who denies it just simply is choosing to be a fool and self-deceiving, is that President Biden is a man who is in fairly serious cognitive decline. This is something I went through over the internet looking at articles from around the world, and it's amazing to me how many nations and their leaders and their presses are making comment on the fact that he is clearly a man who is not up to the task. But there is a parallel, as I said, to what happened in Nazi Germany. You see, Hitler, when he became a member of the parliament, the Reichstag in Germany, headed a party that basically controlled about 30% of the Reichstag. We would say the Congress, or the legislative branch of the German Weimar Republic. So he wasn't powerful enough or had enough control to become really the nominated to become the chancellor, which is what he wanted to be. It's kind of like being the prime minister. And over the chancellor or the prime minister was the president of the country. Well, the president was a man by Paul von Hindenburg. He was a field marshal, a hero of World War I amongst the German people. He was a Prussian general. He also was elected president in 1925 and served all the way till his death in 1934. He was a man who was held in high regard by his own people. But one of the things that was happening was he was also, by the time Hitler came to the Reichstag in 1933, he was in significant cognitive decline. We could call it what it was. He had severe dementia. And in order to create a coalition government in the Reichstag, what he did was, or what his advisors told him to do, was form a coalition government by making Hitler the chancellor. And so they felt he can control Hitler because if he's chancellor, he can't do anything without the president's approval. Well, that's what happened. But unfortunately, what it did was it meant that Hindenburg began to actually give Hitler more and more control and authority till the point that Hitler actually was running the country, not Hindenburg. Hindenburg became really a ghost leader, a placeholder, nothing more than really a cipher who signed the documents that Hitler wanted him to sign. And then Hindenburg died. Hitler declared a state of emergency, and in that said that he would combine both the role of the president and the chancellor, and as a result he became the Fuhrer. I think that in many ways we see a very similar dynamic right now, because I feel that most people understand that the President Biden is not really leading the country. They talk about the people that are around him, but certainly Kamala Harris, who was handpicked for that role by Barack Obama and George Soros, certainly she is the one who is more and more taking a key role. In fact, it was notable, one of the unusual aspects, is that after the election, usually the president calls some of the primary leaders, the Prime Minister of Canada and the Prime Minister of France and England and so forth, as well as Israel, because Israel is our leading ally in the world, militarily and otherwise, as well as in the Middle East, a very important area. Usually the president, first thing he does is he begins calling all these individuals and beginning to discuss policy directions and explaining how his government's going to react to issues they're concerned with. Well, that didn't necessarily happen. It was interesting because we find that the person who was calling Trudeau in Canada, who called Macron in France, and also many other leaders, was not the president, but in fact it was Kamala Harris. This has never happened before. We would really say it's an abdication of his presidential duties. But if you add to the fact that he didn't call Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, for over a month, until finally the press was making such a big issue that he dropped him a call, if you will. But at the same time, he had managed to call Putin, in which he created an offensive rift right now that is now creating all sorts of tensions between the United States and Russia and her allies. But also, he spent 2 hours, unprecedented, 2-hour phone call with President Xi of China, which, I mean, that's, like I say, it's just unheard of to have a 2-hour conversation. Well, the end of it is we're not privy to what was ever discussed. Unlike the Trump presidency, he didn't have people who were leaking information to the press about the phone calls and oftentimes reporting them inaccurately and distorting them. But essentially, we find this is really a very amazing, important shift. And you add to the fact that he's had no press conferences. Here he is, longer than any president in the history of press conferences. He hasn't had one. And he doesn't hold any unscripted public appearances. In other words, it's very clear that when he speaks publicly, he's speaking to a reading from a teleprompter, and sometimes he's been challenged even in that task. But I think that what stands out as well, too, is he clearly they call it the most progressive, I would call him the most radical, far-left, socialist legislative agenda that we've seen of any president in our history. I mean, even within the $2 trillion stimulus package that Congress held up until after the election, only 9% of that money is actually going to stimulate the economy. Most of it's going to various pet funds and projects and basically paying off many of the blue states that are upside down because they shut their economies. Well, they're getting bailed out now by the federal government, something that, is really not unfair, that for those states like, say, Arkansas or many other states, Texas, Florida, so forth, who have balanced their budgets, they're having to take their tax dollars to pay off the debts of California, New York, Chicago, Illinois, and New Jersey, all of them which were run by Democratic governors who had extreme lockdown policies. So their economies were just about wiped out. So they're getting this major bailout to try to bring them back from the brink. But also part of his legislative agenda is things that he's done. First of all, he had more executive orders, some 60 within the first day of his presidency, which is completely unprecedented. He is promoting what's called the Equality Act, and we'll talk about more about that in the future, as well as H.R. 1, the People's Act. And one of the things you know about politicians, when they name something, it doesn't mean what it says it means. It's not the People's Act. I call it the Nancy Pelosi Act, which is designed to ensure that her party stays in power for the rest of human existence. But it's the executive orders that I find most fascinating, because what they do is really, many of them reverse Trump's positions, things that were most of us considered very positive in dealing with immigration, and particularly the wall, legalizing illegal immigration, removing abortion restrictions, reversing a kind of a reverse racism and promotion of transgenderism. All of these things have been on the agenda of these new executive orders and have long-range effects and really kind of change the structure. Now, I begin by referring to this as a blitzkrieg. And why do I call it a blitzkrieg? Well, blitzkrieg was something that the Nazi military developed, and it literally means lightning war. Blitz, lightning, war, Krieg, war. And it was really the key to their early successes, because what they did is they would use a pinpointed attack. Instead of organizing mass armies on a border and then invading over a large area, they did basically the same thing that Schwarzkopf did in Iraq. He had a very focused, targeted attack on a very weak point, and then he rushed across with loads of arms, throwing the enemy into chaos. And that's the idea, that you hit them hard, you hit them heavy, you hit them fast, and then they become dislocated, imbalanced, and it makes it very difficult to have any kind of organized response. And it's simply designed not just to defeat your enemy, but rather to annihilate your enemy. And so what I'm basically saying is that the Democrats have this agenda that they're pushing forward right now, and it's really a form of legislative blitzkrieg. They're concentrating all their efforts on a few key issues that we'll go into at some future time, and they're hitting them really, really hard and heavy, things like immigration, abortion, and transgenderism in particular, and climate change, so forth. But also the idea is they come so fast and hard and so powerfully in the force of what they're doing that it's really thrown any kind of opposition into an imbalance. The Republicans find themselves arguing amongst themselves on how they're going to respond to some of these things, and essentially don't respond at all because they're not unified. And the bottom line is, it's designed not just to defeat the Republicans or the conservatives or anybody who opposes them, but really to annihilate any opposition that conservatives might raise. And so it's really designed to change the world as we know it. And so as a result, I said basically the problem is that many Christians and conservatives are not responding. They're not challenging or pushing back very effectively. But I think most importantly, they're not on their knees. And I find people who sometimes say, well, we shouldn't get involved in these political issues. I think, first of all, I doubt you ever pray about those political issues because you don't realize what an impact they will have upon your life. And if you enjoy the freedom of worship and the freedom to live out your faith and the freedom to make decisions based upon your conscience, then you should be very concerned about these issues, and you should be in prayer every day. But in the future podcasts, I'll present some of the specifics and how these things will touch your life. So, out of time, drawn to a close here, but I look forward to continuing this conversation with you next time. Blessings.